In 2026, tariffs are back, officially at 75% in the US market, not as a policy tool, but as a weapon this time. First at 25%, then at 25% again because we love Russian oil, and then 25% again because the US hates Iran. And amidst this, as we come closer to completing 75 years of our Indian constitution and just 20 years away from our Viksit Bharat goal of 2047 of being a developed nation, I really think that it's in a way a very good stress test to see if India can make it happen before 2047. The US is slapping tariffs on every other nation every other month like it's a fortnightly ritual, while China is so immune to these tariffs that it has achieved the highest ever exports to the US in 2025 with a 50% tariff, and that speaks volumes about its resilience. But India is hitting a wall. How is the dream of Viksit Bharat 2047, which aims at a developed, self-reliant, high-income India, possible if we are not exporting the things that the world rewards, like electronics and chips? If we are being slapped tariffs by our largest export partner, which is the US, if we are not able to negotiate or hold any leverage in this tariffs war, if our manufacturing share is 1/10 of China's, or our youth unemployment is 2 to 3 times of the total headline unemployment, or most of our workforce is in the informal sector, we are only 2 decades away from 2047, and that does not sound like enough time. But here's where it gets interesting. Our exports didn't fall even after the US slapped 50% tariffs last year. We are exporting more electronics than before, and our capacity utilization is more lucrative for investors than ever before. So in this world of oil wars, having an export partner which is an international bully at this point and racing against time for chips, AI, solar panels, crude oil, and a falling currency, can India still break through and become Viksit Bharat by 2047? Hello and welcome back to Angel One Economics. My name is Utsari, and today we decode how realistic is Viksit Bharat 2047 mission and how the tariffs by the US is putting this ambition under a stress test, from where we could either rise or fall. We'll divide this video into 4 sections. What is driving India's growth? What really needs to drive India's growth? What are these US tariffs? And lastly, the most important, why aren't Indian firms expanding in India itself? Let's first understand what have been the historical drivers of India's growth. First is private consumption and second is services. But this alone is now becoming a liability for India because our manufacturing share has been stuck at 14 to 15% for years. Small potatoes compared to China and Vietnam, And that means a nation rich in ideas and engineers is still selling mostly fuels and gems and textiles, and not engines or semiconductors. Next, let's see what we export and import the most, or where do we have a competitive advantage. Now, we export mainly consumer goods while China exports mainly capital goods, followed by consumer goods as well. But remember this, consumer goods are at a higher risk with tariffs because they are replaceable, unlike capital goods, which needs not just manufacturing but also innovation, both in which we are lagging far behind. See, we mainly export mineral fuels, gems and jewelry, cotton and textiles, organic chemicals, but notice what's missing? Network goods. The share of that is just 10% of our exports. And meanwhile, another country besides China and Korea that has recently turned the tables is Vietnam, which has a 50% share of exports selling electronics and machinery. Yes, 50%. So what really needs to drive India's growth? First is productivity. The demographic dividend that we have been so proud of is of no use if the working age population is unemployable. A demographic dividend only works when the youth is employed, productive, and paid enough to consume. India still has to get there in all of these 3. While our overall unemployment rate has fallen to a multi-year low of 4.7%, the youth segment remains in a state of crisis. This formula of young population meaning faster growth is simply not working. Look at these numbers. We have 370 million people aged from 15 to 29 and 7 to 8 million new entrants into the labor force every year with a backlog of 37 million already unemployed folks. Why? More than half of our graduates lack the skills for immediate employment. Our country's economic progress is strongly correlated to its women workforce participation, and that is at 43%, although it doubled in the last 6 years, but it is still far below China's 60%. And that gap shows how much work remains to fully mobilize India's human capital. Hence, a large youth does not mean high productivity or higher output. The next driver is manufacturing. Our manufacturing sector must expand at mathematically rigorous 14 to 15% annually to meet the targets of Viksit Bharat 2047. But we are now currently at 4 to 5% annual growth rate, while Vietnam is growing annually at 10%. In China and Vietnam's manufacturing value is currently at 25% of their GDP, while ours is 14% of our GDP for several years. In simple words, if you want to create more jobs, manufacturing and export is not desirable, but essential now. China has proved this post-WTO in the 2000s when it created 70 million jobs, absorbing all the semi-skilled and the unskilled labor from agriculture. But if India fails to pivot from domestic consumption to global export productivity, it will inevitably succumb to the middle income trap nation with stagnant productivity. The next growth driver should be lower production cost. So what's really stopping India to manufacture more? Maybe the brutal reality of production cost. Let's see 3 factors that influence it. First is the labor cost. India wins here because the wages are among the world's lowest. A Chinese factory worker now costs several times more than that of an Indian one. This is why many firms chase the China plus one strategies and set up shops in Bangalore or Chennai. Next is the logistic cost, which comes to 8% of our GDP, which has fallen from 14%, but it is still higher than the 6%, which is the average share in the trading hubs. Then comes the electric power cost. India is surprisingly expensive to electrify a factory. The industrial electricity cost in India runs way higher than that of China and Vietnam. The next cost is ports and dwell time. It basically means how long your export or your ship waits to leave the country. And in global trade, waiting is losing. So slow ports means slow exports. Now, the average export container dwell time in India is 4.6 days, while that in Vietnam is 4 days. Now, these kinds of numbers really matter because India's ports still lag behind neighbors in efficiency, eating into the labor cost edge that we have. In short, our factories are not as cost competitive as they seem on paper. In this context, I can't help but mention why we keep comparing India with Vietnam lately. In a China plus one world, success is measured by the capture of diverted trade. Despite a demographic advantage that India has, India is being outperformed by more agile neighbors. Vietnam, which has less than 1/10 of India's population, has officially overtaken India in global manufacturing market share. And that gap is most visible in the US market penetration. In 2018 alone, both the nations were roughly in the same level of $46 billion in manufactures to the US. But in 2023, Vietnam surged to $113 billion, while India trailed at $74 billion. That's a huge gap. Now we have covered 2 things. How is India's growth driven? The consumer goods, services, domestic consumption, and then what are the needed growth drivers and how they are lagging, be it productivity, manufacturing, exports, and production cost. Now let's keep all of them aside and just understand the implications of USA's recent 75% tariffs on India. Until last year, the tariffs were standing at 50%, yet India exported more while running a trade surplus of $40 billion with the US. But India's trade surplus with the US is a strange kind of success. It fuels growth, it creates jobs, and it keeps the factories running. But in today's world, it also puts a spotlight on India because the global trade is no longer about efficiency. It's about reciprocity. The new rule by Trump is simple. If you sell too much, protect your own market, and run a big surplus, you get noticed. And noticed economies get targeted. As the trade surplus splits into friendly blocs and strategic partners, countries outside those circles face more friction, not less. And India despite its scale, sits outside most of the major trade agreements. And that means no automatic protection, no preferential access, and no buffer when the policies turn hostile. Now, look at where India's exports are concentrated. A large share goes into just a few sectors: apparels, pharmaceuticals, electronics. These are sectors where the margins are thin, the prices matter, and the tariffs bite fast. And here's the deeper problem: India competes largely on prices and not power, on costs, not on control. So when the tariffs rise, the Indian exporters don't have much room to absorb that shock. They can't cut prices just suddenly. They can't shift the production easily. Hence, the buyers simply move to some other country. Now compare this to China, which absorbs tariffs through scale and supply chain dominance, or Vietnam, which shields itself through trade agreements and deep integration of the global value chains. India has neither advantage, and that makes every tariff feel bigger than it looks on the paper. There's also an uncomfortable irony here. India's own import tariffs remain among the highest for a major economy. So when trade partners talk about reciprocity, India walks into negotiations with a visible surplus and a protected domestic market. In a weaponized trade world, that combination is a liability. The main export sectors that stand at high risk here are electronic and machinery, since it directly competes with the US domestic firms and cheaper alternatives like China and Vietnam. So if they don't want Indian imports, they can easily shift to other alternative nations, which has a free trade agreement. The next sector is gems and jewelry, but it falls under discretionary spending and not a necessity. Now comes high capacity utilization but low investments. Now this picture is a bit mixed. Firstly, what does capacity utilization mean? Imagine a factory that can produce 100 units a day if all machines run at full speed. If it produces 60 units, the capacity utilization is 60%. If it produces 75 units, then the capacity utilization is 75%. And if it produces 90 units, the capacity utilization is 90%. So the capacity utilization tells you how full the factory system is. India's capacity utilization is at 76.8%. When a country breaches 75% mark, capacity expansion becomes unavoidable. So India's is fairly good. So by historical norms, greater than 75% utilization usually triggers a new investment spree. Yet, the expected capex wave hasn't materialized. A real paradox, right? Why aren't firms spending? Among all the big projects that are announced in the recent years, only 10 to 15% have actually been completed and added to the fixed assets. So firms keep announcing grand factories and plants, but very little show up in real world, which is a sign of red tape or caution. Another deep issue is India's missing middle. McKinsey very recently has noted that India has plenty of micro firms and giant conglomerates, but far too few mid-sized industrial champions. Only 10% of today's big Indian companies started as MSMEs in the last 20 years, which implies a gap of companies that should have grown from small to medium. Without a robust base of mid-sized firms, economies of scale and technological upgrades stall. And in manufacturing, this means fragmented producers who can't invest in automation or modern supply chains. That's the paradox. On paper, the conditions look right. Credit is cheaper than it was a decade ago. Corporate balance sheets are cleaner. And policy rhetoric is openly pro-manufacturing. And yet, the private capex remains cautious. The reason is simple. The Indian firms aren't just reacting to demand, they are reacting to risk. So instead of betting big at home, many firms just choose safer options. Sitting on cash, returning money to the shareholders, or expanding capacity outside of India, where the rules are clearer and the integration into global supply chains is smoother. So lastly, is Viksit Bharat 2047 possible? The honest answer is uncomfortable, but powerful. Yes, it is possible, but not automatically. And not by intention alone, because nothing in the data suggests that India is failing. But nothing suggests that India is safe either. India is not collapsing under tariffs. Exports did not fall when the US imposed 50% tariffs last year. The electronics exports are rising and the factories are running at 76% capacity, which is good enough for new investments. On the surface, this looks like resilience. But scratch a little deeper and you see the tension. Because in today's world, development doesn't come from being large. It comes from being indispensable. And China is indispensable because it controls the supply chains. Vietnam is indispensable because it is embedded in them. India is still negotiating its place. This is why tariffs matter so much in this story, not because they destroy the trade, but because they expose the weakness of a nation. They reveal who has the buffers, who has alternatives, and who still is competing on price instead of power. In this world, countries don't become developed by wanting it badly. They become developed by building things the world cannot afford to lose. And that is the real challenge in front of India to make Viksit Bharat 2047 inevitable. Not growth, not ambition, but the competitive advantage.
Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.